අද්විතීය 200 Mbps ස්පීඩ් එකකින් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ වේගවත්ම සහ පුළුල්තම හෝම් බ්‍රෝඩ්බෑන්ඩ් සම්බන්ධතාවය වන SLT මොබිටෙල් දේශීය ෆයිබර් බලවේගය ඔබත් අදම අත්විඳින්න.
හරිම සුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this Thursday, the 22nd of June 2023. Debtor-led debtor. President accrues success of debt management so far to debtor-led initiative of Sri Lanka. Suggests a new approach in dealing with debtors. Mission possible, IMF. IMF Chief Kristalina Georgieva welcomes the government's ownership to address the current economic challenges. Rights curtailed. UN's Deputy High Commissioner says Sri Lanka's anti-terrorism bill contains provisions restricting freedom of expression. Power plants plans. Minister Kanchana Wijesekara says the government has no plans to sell the Norochole power plant. He further claims that JVP trade unions are behind rumours.
Alliance Finance මෙතුරු රන්නයි සේවාවෙන් රන් පවුම්කට රුපියල් 1,70,000ක ඉහළ අධිකාරම.
ඔබේ විශ්වාසය දෙනු සෙන්සුරයින් දැන් ළඟම ඇති ෆාමසියෙන් ලබාගත හැක.
This is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to AdaDerana First at 9. I'm Aditya Dirasinghe joining you live with the latest in Sri Lanka and around the world. Now in your top story tonight, President Ranil Wickremesinghe says in Sri Lanka as a debtor-initiated talks to avoid insolvency was the key to the success achieved in getting creditors on board with the debt restructuring talks. Addressing a summit for new global financing pact, the president said Sri Lanka was not in favor of a common framework as it could have made the country's debt restructuring process slower and inefficient. Speaking further, President Wickremesinghe also highlighted the need for a new approach in Paris and non-Paris club creditors.
A summit for a new global finance impact commenced at the Palais Brongniart in Paris today. President Ranil Wickremesinghe, who participated in the summit upon an invitation extended by French President Emmanuel Macron, addressed a panel discussion themed Debt and Special Drawing Rights Channeling, Where Do We Stand and How to Go Further.
Following the conclusion of negotiations with the IMF and the successful approval of the EFF, we have had no roadmap to follow regarding the next phase of debt restructuring. So before we can get the next tranche from the IMF. So it's a question of us now mapping the road out. The debtor-led approach was the key to our success. It was our program, not an IMF program. Secondly, we found sponsor for us among the official creditor community. That helps. I am not sure that a binding framework like the common framework would have rendered the process quicker or more efficient. If we have a common framework, what happens is we move as fast as the slowest creditor. So we get tied down. So that's why we're not in favor of a common framework. We were able to create traction with the most committed creditors, raising the general quality and efficiency of the process. Our creditors include the Paris Club and the non-Paris Club members, of which India and China are two of our main creditors. So we've attempted to establish an ad hoc platform for the official creditors, including the Paris Club members and others. India, Hungary, others came on to participate in the ad hoc platform. China participated as observers. We shared the information with all parties on an open, transparent process. Then I must thank IMF. With the intervention of the IMF and Sri Lanka's coordination, we are dealing with both groups. What else helped us was that Sri Lanka had ongoing negotiations with Japan, India and China separately regarding further trade integration and also some of the development programs for the future. This assisted our process. But as far as my experience is, we have to have some improvement for the interaction between the committee and the debtors, because the debt restructuring process is a negotiation and it should by essence be interactive. Looking at the dealing with Paris Club and non-Paris Club, we need a new approach because this is basically a geopolitical issue. The mistrust between US and China and the growing tensions, it has to be addressed by all, not merely by Sri Lanka or the country concerned. If you do not resolve it, I think we will still, in Asia and Africa, we will get caught into another situation not our making. So these would be the major issues that we have addressed.
Meanwhile, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, confirms that the IMF is committed to supporting Sri Lanka's economic reforms to improve the living standards of its people. This was echoed during a meeting held between President Ranil Wickremesinghe and the Managing Director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. The IMF chief went on to say that she warmly welcomes the strong ownership by the government of Sri Lanka to address current economic challenges. President Wickremesinghe met with the IMF chief prior to attending the World Leaders Summit for a new global financing pact, which is scheduled to take place in Paris today and tomorrow. Meanwhile, during his visit to the UK, President Ranil Wickremesinghe expressed confidence of the Sri Lankan economy returning to normalcy by 2024. Addressing the International Democrat Union Forum in London, the head of state noted that his government aims to complete vital restructure reforms in a bid to accelerate economic liberalisation and attract more investments.
President Ranil Wickremesinghe participated in the 40th anniversary event of the International Democrat Union in London earlier this week. Over 400 people from 67 countries, including legislators, campaigners, leaders, prime ministers and presidents, were brought together during the event.
How long till Sri Lanka is kind of back to a reasonable growing economy? What's the time frame?
We have to get a major foreign exchange sources turning again. Firstly, is the remittances from abroad, which had come down, it seems to be restoring. More and more money is coming every month. Second is going to be tourism next year, tourism big one. The problem is going to be export, especially apparel, since Europe, the European economy is down and the US is down. Basically, apparel export this quarter is down to about 25%. It's not only Sri Lanka, Bangladesh is also affected. So the prosperity of the Western economy is determined. But I think by end of 2024, we'll be back to normal. The funding agencies will all get in and help us once the debt restructuring is over. I plan to finalize the debt restructuring by September. As I go back, the Parliament will vote on Sri Lanka's debt restructuring strategy once that is on. But idea is, what I want to completely liberalize, the structural reforms are being done. Go ahead, immediately liberalize the economy and then ensure that more investments come into Sri Lanka. In the long term, you need investment to shift the balance of trade in your favor. So might as well start that now. But I am confident by 2024 we'll have much better.
Now, United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights Nada Al-Nashif says Sri Lanka's new anti-terrorism bill contains sweeping provisions that would limit freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and possibly labour rights. The Deputy High Commissioner emphasised this while addressing the 53rd session of the United Nations Human Rights Council yesterday. In the meantime, Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva, Himali Anratilaka, expressed the government's commitment to safeguard human rights, peace and harmony to the UNHRC.
At the 6th meeting of the 53rd session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, an update on promoting reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka was delivered by the UN Deputy High Commissioner Nada Al-Nashif. She raised concerns over the misuse of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights Act and the usage of the Prevention of Terrorism Act.
We encourage the dialogue that the President has initiated with Tamil political parties and welcome his promise to stop land acquisition for archaeological, forestry or security purposes, an increasing source of local conflict and tension. Plans for more inclusive memorialization and other forms of dealing with the past have been announced. The Supreme Court has issued an important order for compensation to be paid to the victims of the 2019 Easter Sunday attacks. However, these intentions need to materialize into new laws, policies and practices that will make good on these promises and bring about tangible change. The announcement of plans for a truth commission or similar reconciliation mechanisms requires attention. The past months have unfortunately witnessed an old reflex of using draconian laws to curtail opposition and control civic space, with a heavy heavy-handed approach to protests far too often, including the arrest of protest leaders and forceful crowd control measures, as well as the persistent use of the military in police functions. Recent arrests over statements made during comedy performances and of members of parliament engaged in protests exemplify this concern. In March of this year, the Human Rights Committee expressed deep concern about the misuse of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Act against journalists, human rights defenders and other civil society actors. The government has committed to replacing the Prevention of Terrorism Act with legislation that adheres to international standards, but the new anti-terrorism bill that was gazetted in March contains sweeping provisions that would limit freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and even labor rights. Following strong pushback from civil society, the draft bill has now been recalled for additional consultations. I encourage the government to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act and in the meantime to implement fully a strict moratorium on its use, considering that the ordinary criminal code and other ancillary laws already provide adequate tools for law enforcement.
In response to the statement of the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva, Himali Arunatilaka, said that the government is committed to actively engage with regular human rights mechanisms.
The government is continuing its focus on long-term measures towards reconciliation and accountability within the constitutional framework. The government is determined to safeguard peace and harmony amongst all communities while respecting fundamental freedoms. The government is engaging in further consultations with all stakeholders on the draft anti-terrorism bill and receiving views to ensure that it is in compliance with international standards while catering to domestic needs. In March, the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Justice were in South Africa for a preliminary study of their experience on truth and reconciliation. The concept of a mechanism that would suit Sri Lanka has received cabinet approval and an advisory committee appointed to discuss and facilitate drafting of the required legislation. 92% of the private lands retained by the military has been released to the legitimate civilian owners. Action has also been initiated to restore land ownership of people who had been traditionally occupying and cultivating their lands, but which were declared as forest or wildlife reservations after being abandoned due to the conflict. A roadmap to remap such areas and grant deeds has been approved by the cabinet. Sri Lanka has categorically rejected the external evidence gathering mechanism established following resolutions 46/1 and 51/1, which will have wide-ranging legal and political implications. Notwithstanding its position and despite the severe constraints, Sri Lanka actively and constructively engaged with the regular human rights mechanisms.
In Parliament today, the question of the ownership and future of Sri Lanka's power generation plants was queried by the Samaga Janabalawegaya. Kanchana Wijesekara, the Minister of Power and Energy, responded, clarifying that no discussions have been made or planned with regards to the Noracholi power plant, but indicate that diesel and furnace power plants should be restructured. He further clarified that on the stance on the earnings accrued by the future suppliers and the regulations that govern forex earnings received by such entities.
අපි දැක්කා විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ වෘත්තීය සමිති විරෝධය ප්‍රකාශ කරනවා නොරොච්චෝලේ ගල්අඟුරු බලාගාරයත් ඒක ඔස්ට්‍රේලියානු සමාගමකට ඒ වගේම ජල විදුලි බලාගාර චීන සහ කොරියානු සමාගම් වලටත් ලබා දෙන්න කටයුතු කරනවා කියන එක. විශේෂයෙන්ම වෘත්තීය සමිති කියලා කිව්වට ගරු කතානායකතුමනි සියලුම වෘත්තීය සමිති මේ ප්‍රතිව්‍යුහගත කිරීමේ වැඩපිළිවෙලට විරෝධය දක්වලා නැහැ. විශේෂයෙන්ම ජනතා විමුක්ති පෙරමුණට සම්බන්ධ වෘත්තීය සමිති පමණයි මේ වැරදි මතය රට තුල ගෙනියන්න උත්සාහ කරන්නේ. ඒ උත්සාහ කරන පිරිසත් අද වෘත්තීය සමිති කියලා අටවගෙන හිටියට ඒ පිරිස අඩුම තරමේ විදුලි බල මණ්ඩලයේ සේවය කරන පිරිස් නෙවෙයි. එතකොට මෙවැනි පිරිස් මතයක් මතු කරලා තිබුණ ඔබතුමා කිව්වා වගේ නොරොච්චෝලේ බලාගාරය දැනටමත් ඔස්ට්‍රේලියානු සමාගමකට ලබා දෙන්න තීන්දුව කළා තියෙනවා කියලා. ගරු කතානායකතුමනි අපි වගකීමෙන් කියන්න පුළුවන් නොරොච්චෝලේ බලාගාරය පිළිබඳව කිසිම අපි එහෙම තීන්දුවක් අරගෙන නැහැ. සාකච්ඡා කරලත් නැහැ නොරොච්චෝලේ බලාගාරය ලබා දීම පිළිබඳව කිසිම පෞද්ගලික සමාගමක් එක්ක. විවිධ සමාගම් අපිට වෙලා තියෙනවා යෝජනා එවලා තියෙනවා නොරොච්චෝලේ බලාගාරයේ ආශ්‍රිතව වෙනත් විකල්ප ව්‍යාපෘති ආරම්භ කරන්න. ඉදිරියේදී නොරොච්චෝලේ බලාගාරය පිළිබඳව රජය විසින් තීන්දුවක් ගනු ඇති. ඒ වගේම ගරු කතානායකතුමනි ජල විදුලිය සම්බන්ධයෙන් මොකද ජල විදුලි බලාගාරවල අයිතිය තියෙන්නේ අත්තම විදුලි බල මණ්ඩලයට නෙවෙයි. ජල විදුලි බලාගාරවල අයිතිය තියෙන්නේ වාරිමාර්ග අමාත්‍යාංශයට ජල කළමනාකරණ අධිකාරියට. පැහැදිලිවම රජයේ ප්‍රතිපත්ති තීන්දුව තියෙන මේ සමාගම් බවට පරිවර්තනය කිරීමේදී අපේ තියෙන ජල විදුලි බලාගාර සියල්ලම එක සමාගමක් බවට පරිවර්තනය කරලා ඒක රජය සතුවම 100%ක් තිබිය යුතුයි කියන එක. නිසා මේක වැරදි මතයක් ගෙනියලා තියෙනවා. මේක මේ කොරියාවට චීනයට දෙන්න සාකච්ඡා කරලා තියෙනවා කියලා එහෙම සාකච්ඡාවක් කරලත් නැහැ. එහෙම දෙන්නත් බෑ. එහෙම දෙන්න ආණ්ඩුවට බලාපොරොත්තුවකුත් නැහැ. ඒ වගේම මේක සමාගම් බවට පරිවර්තනය කිරීමේදී අපේ ඩීසල් බලාගාර, අපේ තියෙන දැවිතෙල් බලාගාර මේවා සම්බන්ධයෙන් අපි තියෙනවා එක්ක පෞද්ගලික හවුල් ව්‍යාපාර හැටියට ඉදිරියට යන්න ඕන. එහෙම නැත්නම් පෞද්ගලික ව්‍යාපාර හැටියට. මොකද මේවා තමයි අපිට ඉදිරියේදී පරිවර්තනය කරන්න ඕන LNG බවට පරිවර්තනය කරන්න විදුලි බල මණ්ඩලයටත් ආණ්ඩුවටත් මුදල් නැහැ. සිනෝපෙක් ආයතනය මෙහි ස්ථාපනය කරේ විශේෂයෙන්ම ඩොලර් ලංකාවේ හිඟතාවයත් එක්ක දැන් ඒකේ රොයල්ටි එක අරගෙන නැහැ. මේ පිළිබඳව ඔබතුමා පැහැදිලි කිරීමක් කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් අපි විශේෂයෙන්ම කොන්දේසි ප්‍රමාණයක් පැනෙව්වා අලුතෙන් සැපයුම්කරුවන් තෝරා ගැනීමේදී ඔවුන් ආයෝජනයක් ලෙස තමයි මේ රටට තෙල් ආනයනය කරන්න ඕන. තෙල් ආනයනය කරලා ඉවරලා මාස 12ක් යනකම් ඒ මුදල් අපේ රටේ තියාගන්න ඕන එළියට ගෙනියන්න බෑ කියලා. ඔවුන් ඩොලර් හැටියට ආයෝජනය කරලා තෙල් ගේනවා රටට ගේන තෙල් ටික අලෙවි කරාට පස්සේ ඔවුන්ට ලැබෙන්නේ රුපියල් වලින්. ඒතර මහ බැංකුව පසුගිය අවුරුද්දේ අපිට කියලා තිබුණා මාස 9ක කාලයක් යනකම් තියෙන රුපියල් පරිවර්තනය කරන්න දෙන්න එපා විදේශ විනිමයට. මොකද අපේ රටේ තිබුණු විදේශ විනිමය අර්බුදේ නිසා. හැබැයි මේ අවුරුද්දේ අපිට මහ බැංකුව කියලා තිබුණා මේ ලැබෙන මුදල් ටික රුපියල් ටික මාස 9ක් තියාගෙන ගිහිල්ලා එක සැරේ පරිවර්තනය කරන්න ගියොත් විදේශ විනිමයට ලොකු පීඩනයක් එල්ල වෙන්න පුළුවන් අපේ විදේශ සංචිත වලට. ඒ නිසා පරිවර්තනය කිරීම එදිනම කරන්න කියන එක තමයි මහ බැංකුව විසින් අපිට උපදෙස් ලබා දීලා තියෙන්නේ. හැබැයි පරිවර්තනය කරා කියලා ඒක රටෙන් පිටට ගෙනියන්න නෙවෙයි අවසරය දුන්නේ. ඒක මාස 12ම අපේ රටේ තියෙන්න ඕන. ඒ කොන්දේසියේ කිසිම වෙනසක් වෙලා නැහැ. දෙවෙනි කොන්දේසිය තමයි මේ සැපයුම්කරුවන්ට තිබුණ රොයල්ටි එකක් 100%ක රොයල්ටි එකක් දාන්න කියලා. ඒ එකක 100%ක රොයල්ටි එක දාන්න කියලා කිව්වේ විශේෂයෙන්ම අපේ තියෙන පැරණි ණය පියවා ගැනීම සම්බන්ධයෙන්. හැබැයි මේ ක්‍රියාවලිය යන අතරතුරේ අපේ මුදල් අමාත්‍යාංශ විසින් වෙනත් ක්‍රමයක් හඳුන්වලා දුන්නා ඒ ණය පියව ගන්න. ඒ ණය පියවා ගැනීම වෙනුවෙන් දැන් හඳුන්වා දීලා තියෙනවා හැම ලීටරයකටම රුපියල් 50ක බද්දක්. ඒ නිසා එකෙන් කිසිම අවාසියක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ අපේ රටට.
Now we have to look at the issue pertaining to the government policy on attracting investment. Now today I am now part of a select committee which looks into the need for reform in the higher education sector. Our report is to be submitted soon. Our chairman, the Honourable Minister of Justice, will soon be submitting the report. We are looking at ways and means of trying to introduce some far-reaching reforms where Sri Lanka would be made an attractive destination for higher education. So in order to do that, we'll have to introduce some very salient reforms. If you are to invest or if you are to attract foreign investment and to make Sri Lanka a preferred destination for higher education, it is important for us to have a very competitive higher education sector where the state sector will be compelled to compete with private sector higher education providers. Right now it is happening through various other affiliated degrees that are being offered by private higher education providers in this country, but then the quality of their degrees, the accreditation as well as the quality assurance aspect has been seriously neglected. That has to be addressed, unless otherwise we will not be able to attract proper investors into the higher education sector even if we liberalize the existing climate.
A shooting incident took place near a residence in Borella with the use of a T-56 firearm. The incident had reportedly taken place near the residence of the managing director of a well-known footwear company. Meanwhile, in Bandaragama, a tragic accident claimed the life of a 3-year-old when a bus belonging to the Sri Lanka Army hit a motorcycle carrying a mother and a daughter. With that, let's have a look at the other developments around the island in brief.
A shooting was reported from the Borella area this morning. Incident had reportedly taken place near a residence in the Crossroad area in Borella. The police said that the residence belongs to the managing director of a well-known footwear company. According to the police, an unidentified group of individuals who arrived at the location had fired 2 shots at the gate of the residence using a T-56 firearm. The motive behind this incident, however, is yet to be uncovered. Meanwhile, the police had opened fire at a 3-wheeler in the Karapiti area in Gaul after the vehicle had disobeyed a signal to stop. According to the police, the 2 people who had been in the 3-wheeler had reportedly fled the scene. In the meantime, a 3-year-old was killed following an accident which took place in front of the cooperative head office at Bandaragama. A bus belonging to the Sri Lanka Army heading towards Casbava from Bandaragama had reportedly hit a motorcycle carrying the mother and daughter. The driver of the bus in question is currently in police custody. In Moratowa, meanwhile, a fire was reported from the Molpe area in Morotumulla this morning in a junkyard, which has then spread to 3 sheds containing wood in close proximity to the junkyard. The fire destroyed a large amount of wooden goods. However, the fire and rescue unit of Moratowa managed to extinguish the fire with the help of local residents. A group of A-level examiners stopped marking papers this morning and engaged in a strike, stating that they have not still received relevant allowances. Examiners in the Uva College Badulla and Vihara Mahadevi Girls' School paper marking centres gathered in front of the Uva College to engage in the strike.
Minister of Public Security Derana English has issued a directive to the Inspector General of the Police and other senior officers to take immediate action against crimes committed in the western and the southern provinces. Taking into account the prevailing increase in crimes, the minister instructed relevant police officials to take immediate action against those engaged in crimes in both the western and the southern provinces. The directive was issued by the Minister of Public Security during a special discussion with the high-ranking police officials held yesterday. Now, Minister Kanchana Wijesekara says that the Indian energy company Petronet LNG has presented short-term solutions to meet the Ceylon Electricity Board's requirement for liquefied natural gas. Minister Wijesekara tweeted that Petronet LNG presented immediate albeit short-term solutions for the CEB's LNG requirements this morning. Therefore, options for short-term solutions to reduce the cost of generation in the next 24 months from the 600 plus megawatts of LNG power plants available will be pursued, while a long-term plan for the LNG is being finalized. Further, the minister thanked the Indian High Commissioner Gopal Bagle for his efforts in this regard and for organizing the discussions. The officials of the Indian High Commission in Sri Lanka, the CEB, Petronet LNG, the Petroleum Development Authority of Sri Lanka, and officials from the Ministry of Power and Energy attended the occasion. Oil futures down as the Bank of England is expected to raise interest rates for the 13th consecutive time. This and more business news when AdaDerana returns.
ගොඩමඩ පෙරලි කරන බලපුළුවන්කාරයා මහින්ද්‍රා යුවෝ ඩීමෝ වෙතින්. වැඩම ගොඩයි ගොඩම තමයි. ස්වරාජ් ට්‍රැක්ටර් ඩීමෝ වෙතින්. අබාස් මිලගණන් දැවන්ත ලෙස අඩු කළා. TV, ෆ්‍රිජ්, AC, වොෂින් මැෂින්, ලැප්ටොප්, ජංගම දුරකථන මුළුතැන්ගේ උපකරණ ඇතුළු නිෂ්පාදන රැසක් අඩුම මිලට අබාස් වෙතින් පමණයි.
ඒ ත්‍රිත්වයේ තහවුරු කළ විශිෂ්ටත්වය දුෂ්‍යන්ත මහබදුගේ චරිත දිසානායක සමිතරත් නායක සිසිජී නුගේගොඩ ගම්පහ
ෆිසික්ස් නිලන්ත ජයසූරිය නවපන්ති ආරම්භය සුසිපුවන් ගම්පහ සීලින් බෙන් නුගේගොඩ සයන්ස් සෙන්ටර් ගාල්ල
පහනුවර කුරුණෑගල කෑගල්ල අංකකේ භෞතික විද්‍යා පාඨමාලාව නුගේගොඩද අතික්‍රමණය කළ වගයි ෆිසික්ස් දර්ශන ඔකුවෙල
තනිව යන ගමනට නිවැරදි ගිණුම් කරන මග හේමාල් පෙරේරා.
Welcome back. Now in your business news, the Colombo Bourse closed higher today, aided by gains in the industrial sector a day after data showed inflation eased sharply in May. The Colombo Stock Exchange all-share price index closed at 0.13% higher to end at 9,307.87 points. The conglomerate Expo Lanka Holdings and Richard Peries & Company were the top boosters in the index, rising 3.44% and 5.13% respectively. Trading volumes rose to 74.2 million shares from 50.4 million shares in the previous session. Meanwhile, the S&P Sri Lanka 20 climbed 0.17% points to close at 2,667.06 points. The market's turnover rose to 1.95 billion rupees from 1.64 billion rupees in the previous session. The transportation sector was the top contributor to the market turnover, while the capital goods was the second highest contributor. Foreign investors were net buyers in the equity market, purchasing shares worth 79.1 million rupees, while domestic investors were net sellers, offloading shares worth 1.89 billion rupees. Now, in the meantime, global oil prices dipped slightly today. Trade expectations of further interest rate hikes countered by potentially bullish US inventory data after preliminary figures showed a fall in stocks.
Brent futures dropped by 47 cents to end at $76.65 a barrel, and US West Texas Intermediate crude futures were down 44 cents to settle at $72.09. Both benchmarks had steadied in the previous session as US corn and soybean prices raced to multi-month highs, raising expectations that crop shortfalls could lower biofuels blending and increased oil demand. However, the market was cautious after Fed Chair Jerome Powell said 2 more interest rate hikes of 25 basis points each by the end of the year was a pretty good guess. Meanwhile, the Bank of England was expected to raise rates for a 13th time in the face of stubbornly strong inflation. Oil prices held on to most of the previous session's gains as the market kept a lookout for fresh drivers, such as official US oil inventory data, which was due at 14:30 GMT, and Chinese factory activity data due next week. In a preliminary indicator, industry data showed US crude oil inventories fell by about 1.2 million barrels last week, defying forecasts for a build of 300,000 barrels. Meanwhile, an executive of EOG Resources said oil prices could rise as muted increases in US oil production and cuts by OPEC Plus producers will limit supply in the months ahead.
With that, we concludes tonight's edition of AdaDerana First at 9. Stay in touch with us on www.adaderana.lk for further developments around the clock. Thank you. Have a great night.
For news and information you can trust 24 hours a day, visit AdaDerana.lk.